Hi, and welcome to another episode of Learning with Power. This is going to be episode number 40. Yay! The big 4-0 we've hit. Yay! Alright, and so in this episode we're going to continue our historical series that we were doing. And this is going to be the world in 2000 BC. And so basically that's going to encompass Egypt. That's the primary thing that was going on between 3000 and 2000 BC. The most significant thing that happened was the emergence of the great Egyptian culture at that time. Now, really, Egypt sort of had two cultures, two great cultures, with an intermediate period in between when everything kind of collapsed, and then it was sort of, then it came back again. Okay, so basically, the thing you have to understand about the world between 3000 and 2000 BC is that, yes, we have a great civilization. We have empires. We have kings and pharaohs and great kings even. We have writing now. And we've got a lot of the signs of civilization is happening, but it's not something that's a worldwide phenomenon. And even though there's varying degrees of civilization in different parts of the world, or in all the major parts of the world, we're still just talking about pockets. So there's a developed city here, civilization. There's a developed city over here. There's a developed city over here, and then there's a developed city over here. But 90% of the world is not developed. And the people are just living the way that they had been living for thousands and thousands of years. Although by this time they're not necessarily hunter-gatherers. So they've generally settled down, and they're getting more agricultural. They're growing things. They're doing animal husbandry, things like that. But they're basically, like barbarians and things like that, or in the Americas, the ancient Indians, the way they were. And they did not have horses yet, because that was actually brought by the Spanish. So we're talking about a very, very just pockets of civilization here and there. But one civilization in particular grew to spectacular proportions and did spectacular things and built really impressive structures, huge structures that are still there to this day. And up until really the early 1900s, the pyramids were the tallest structure ever made by man at that, until, maybe until like 100 years ago. So it really tells you, put in perspective how amazing these structures were. And all of the pyramids that we think of, the Great Pyramid at Saqqara, it's with Q's, and the pyramids at Giza that you see with the Sphinx in front of it, that was all built in around 2600 BC. And then after that, not so much. They didn't build any major pyramids after that. They built things. Their culture changed in different ways. And when we talk about Egypt at this time, between 3000 and 2000 BC, we're not talking about the great pharaoh Ramses II, because Ramses II didn't come around until about 1300 BC, and so by the time he came around, even though he's considered to be the greatest pharaoh, the pyramids were already ancient. They were already 1,000 years old, even in his day. So that's how amazing, the Great Pyramids are. But at the time that they built the Great Pyramids, they had quite a developed civilization. And they had writing. They had hieroglyphic writing at that time. It hadn't evolved into hieratic writing yet. But the most comprehensive writing that was developed, the first writing really was cuneiform in ancient Sumeria in the Middle East. And that was really evolved around 3500 BC. And it went from, at first it was just about agricultural accounting and things like that. You know, John has 14 sheep and 6 goats, and he sold 2 sheep to Jesus or Ahmed or whatever for X amount of debits or whatever. And so, but eventually it evolved into writing that was done for literature and actually law and writing laws. And they actually wrote laws starting between 3000 and 2000 BC. And so actually cuneiform predates hieroglyphics by a few hundred, but only a few hundred years. Chinese writing did not come around until considerably later. Actually, where do I have Chinese writing did not happen until around 1200 BC. So this is well over 1,000 years before China even developed their writing. So that's how advanced these civilizations were. But the most advanced civilization was Egypt, clearly Egypt. And so you might say, okay, so why Egypt? Why Egypt? So we're starting to evolve. We're doing agriculture now. We're doing animal husbandry. We're settling down. We're not so nomadic anymore. We're not, you know, hunters and gatherers strictly anymore. We're starting to, you know, to have people and starting to form in settle in larger groups and things like that. So why in Egypt? Why along the Nile River in Egypt? So why not in southeastern, sub-Saharan Africa, where basically mankind first evolved and Homo sapiens first emerged? Why not there? Why wasn't that the very first place for civilization? And I think that's a very good question. And basically, civilization had required a couple of factors. It required one, you had to have the perfect combination of things, and so it had to be a really nice area that a lot of people have chosen to settle along this area. And when you have a lot of people all settling then in a small area, relatively small area, you've got to have some sort of organization or everybody's just going to kill everybody. And so that inspired some civilization, and the Nile River was on the way, wasn't it? You know, so all of the Homo sapiens that were evolving in sub-Saharan Africa, as they were walking northward, you know, the Sahara Desert obviously was a big obstacle, so they had to go over toward the east and go up through Sudan, what's today's Sudan, and go up the Nile River. And then when they discovered the Nile River, they were like, oh wow, this is it, this is paradise, this is great. So all along the Nile River, and so no doubt all of these successful people that migrated had to have walked along the Nile River. I mean, that's really the most logical way that they would have migrated. And then once they got up into northern, or actually what was called Lower Egypt, then they would migrate across the Sinai, into the Levant, into the Middle East, up to present-day Turkey, and around and into Eastern Europe that way. But in the meantime, they landed upon the Nile, and you would have to think that they started settling in the Nile a long time ago, you know, like 100,000 years ago, and the people that migrated and progressed beyond that, you would have to think are the people who were kind of the outcasts, you know, people that didn't cut it with the other people that were already settled along the Nile, because no doubt there were lots of people already settled on the Nile. I'm not sure exactly when the settlements began. I'm not even sure if archaeologists have determined exactly when people first started settling on the Nile. But granted, it was at least 50,000 years ago. So it took quite a while before we actually have a civilization, and so a lot of things happen in the meantime, and so again, you have to have the perfect combination, the best of all worlds. And so what happened was you had the lower Egypt and you had Upper Egypt. And with the way that we look at maps, you would think that Upper Egypt would be north and Lower Egypt would be south, but it's not actually that way. it has to do with altitude. So Upper Egypt is actually southern Egypt because it was at a higher altitude. And Lower Egypt is at a lower Egypt, which is northern Egypt, because the Nile flowed from the south to the north, and so it flowed downhill. And so as you go from a higher elevation in Lower Egypt, in southern Egypt, it progresses toward a lower elevation in northern Egypt, so that's Lower Egypt. And so for a while, great kings emerged in both the south and in the north. And there was a fair amount of distance in between that divided the two, and you had two independent cultures that were evolving, or civilizations that were evolving over time, which was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Finally, though, in around 3000 BC, you have a guy called Narmer, King Narmer, or Menes as he's called, M-E-N-E-S. He was the first king to actually unite both Lower and Upper Egypt together to make one great civilization. And this gave him and his descendants quite a bit of power now. Now there's a lot of people who are under his authority, a lot of people. So like I said, they were already settling in little small groups, some little small families. You know, when people were hunter-gatherers, they would travel in groups of like less than 10 people. But less than 10 people, and then they decided to settle along the Nile, and then another group of less than 10 people, and they decided to settle along the Nile, and eventually it added up. And eventually there were a lot of people all along the Nile River, because the Nile River is really, probably even to this day, is one of the most fertile places on the entire planet. And so it's a great place to stop wandering. You know, let's settle here, let's grow stuff here, and if you grow stuff, then you have land, and you have to have debates, and you have arguments and discussions. Whose land is that? Whose produce is this going to be? Who's got control of this produce? Who's going to be able to eat it or give it to their family or even sell it for or trade it for whatever they can trade it for? So this is why, this is where civilizations developed at that time. And, excuse me, so eventually you have a guy called Imhotep, who was basically a civil engineer, and he was employed by a guy named Djoser, who was a great pharaoh at the time. And Djoser tried to, or decided to, build the Saqqara pyramid. And so he got with Imhotep, and they got together, and they decided to undertake this massive building project, the likes of which had never been done before anywhere in the world, the likes of which did not happen anywhere in the world other than the Giza pyramids, but not after that. And it required the cooperation and participation of thousands, literally thousands of people, all working together in order to build this. And they weren't necessarily all slaves, because you would have rebellion, revolution. You wouldn't succeed in your project if they were all treated very badly. So we're discovering now that actually they weren't really treated badly. They had a settlement, they had homes, they had schools, they had doctors and physicians that lived amongst them. They worked normal hours. They weren't slaving all night long and all day long. They weren't being whipped or anything like that. They weren't indentured. They were actually getting paid something, or there was something in it for them to be working on this project. And so you have a situation where you have a lot of population. You have a king now that's controlling Upper and Lower Egypt, and so he's in control of a lot of people, maybe more than 1 million, and at least. And so he's able to get together thousands of people, all to participate on this one construction project. And pardon me about the camera there. In around 2650 BC, Djoser decided to build what would eventually become Saqqara, the pyramid at Saqqara. Now Saqqara is more in Upper Egypt than in Lower Egypt because it's south of Giza. But it's still not that far away. It's still generally in Upper Egypt, or excuse me, in Northern Egypt. Yeah. All right. And so anyway, so he had the authority to do it, and eventually they actually completed the pyramid, and it was more or less just a giant tomb for himself is why they built it. And I guess he wanted to leave some kind of a legacy on the world. I guess he intended that this would probably stand for thousands of years. I guess they expected that it would. And I guess that's the reason why he did it. We can only speculate, though, as to exactly why he did it. So anyway, so in 3200, you have writing that's evolved, and that's hieroglyphics, which was basically pictograms. And then hieroglyphics then eventually evolved into what's called hieratic writing, and then Demotic writing, not demonic, but Demotic writing was actually another evolution, and actually eventually they found the Rosetta Stone. Napoleon's men found a Rosetta Stone in 1790s, which is actually wound up being the key to how to interpret what all these languages mean, and that's why we're able to read hieroglyphics now. So hieroglyphics even that were written 25 and 2500 BC, so we're talking 4500, or actually the Djoser Saqqara pyramid 4650 BC, so we're talking, or excuse me, 2650 BC, so we're talking 4650 years ago. That's quite a long time. The pyramid's very old, and if you look at it, it looks pretty old. And there were other structures around the pyramid that were also pretty impressive, but the one structure I'd be wary about, because there's this one structure where there's this huge like concrete slab on top of these two fairly thin pillars, and that was put on there in the 1900s. But they claimed that he built it. He did build things that were similar to that, though, but not quite the one that you can see today. But anyway, and so Egypt was unified at around 3100 BC, actually, and ultimately a guy emerged called King Narmer that unified all of the people, and he had a tremendous amount of power, but he didn't have the gumption to go ahead and build a pyramid. It wasn't until 300 years later when Djoser decided, you know what, I think I'll build a pyramid. Now, pyramids are actually pretty common structures for ancient man to build. There's actually a lot of ancient pyramids all around the world, from, you know, the Aztecs and the Mayans, and they found one in Eastern Europe, and there's lots of places where they've actually found pyramids of different sizes. Some of the pyramids, like in Mexico, are quite big. But nothing, of course, compared to what they did in Egypt. But there were a lot of pyramids all over the world that ancient man built. And the reason why is because basically it's a simple structure, right? You build a big foundation of rocks. You move other rocks on top of that. It's a little bit lower, you know, less. You know, you put on top of that foundation, you put on more rocks, and eventually you get all the way to the top where there's just one rock at the top. It's a simple concept, but it's hard to pull off once you get high. You know, I mean, once the elevation becomes, you know, 100 feet high, how do you get up there? That's the question. That's the problem, and we just have to speculate as to how it was done. All right, so hieratic scripts formed in around 2400 BC, and it was actually the very first, you know, it was, I mean, that was similar with cuneiform. Cuneiform emerged as a way to do accounting and agricultural accounting and things like that. But hieratic script is kind of even with cuneiform as far as being something that people, not necessarily the educated people, but people that were just, you know, people in general could write, and you could actually write it rather than being characters or you know, pictograms and things like that. And with cuneiform, you know, they were like these little styluses that they used with little triangle-looking things that they would make different marks in clay. And today there are thousands of cuneiform tablets in existence. And if any of you really want to get me a good gift, buy me a cuneiform tablet. That would be great. That's the oldest. That would be the oldest written thing that you could own. Okay, so we have what's called the early dynastic period, the first dynasty, which was basically 3100 BC, which is King Narmer and the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, until 2686 BC, which basically is the time of Djoser, and that's called the early dynastic period. And so then you have Djoser, and then he starts what's called the Old Kingdom, and it goes from 2686 BC to 2181 BC. So the empire that King Narmer created in 3100 BC actually survived for about 1,000 years and was a really great empire. And in that period, they also built the pyramids at Giza and the Sphinx as well. And the pyramids at Giza were built between 2589 and 2504. So all the major big pyramids that we know of that there are, so there's like 3 big pyramids in Giza and 1 big pyramid at Saqqara. They were all done between 2650 BC and 2500 BC, all within that period. And basically, you know, once Djoser built Saqqara, I guess that inspired others to say, hey, I want to build a pyramid too. So they built one in a different area, which was more in Lower Egypt, in Giza. But still, ultimately, then they didn't build any more after that. And that was kind of a mystery that, you know, and so, like I say, even 1,000 years later, you still have the great Egyptian empire, and they're still using the same kind of writing, like at this point it's hieratic writing, which eventually formed into Demotic writing. But even in like Ramses II's period, even in his era, these pyramids, these huge pyramids that they built there, were ancient even in his day. And they really are a curiosity. And they are the first, you know, structure that that emerged, that humans built, that stood the test of time, and they're still there today, and they're still tourism. I guess Egyptian tourism has started 4,500 years ago. I guess they had tours even then. I don't know. Anyway, but then after the Old Kingdom, you have what's called the First Intermediate Period. And the First Intermediate Period was a difficult time. And so after a pharaoh called Pepi II, after he died, you had some climate change. And actually all around the world, around 2000 BC, or like 2100 BC, you have severe climate change that happened. And it wasn't because they made too many cars, and it wasn't because they made too many factories. It was just natural occurring thing. But because of this climate change, this severe climate change that happened, you had now severe droughts now happening in the area of Egypt, and in other places you have severe flooding, and this is what happens with climate change. You've got extreme climatic events that happen, and so when you have extreme climate change in those days, the people no longer are having faith in the gods. You know, the gods are no longer favorable upon us, or looking favorable upon us, and so the people are losing faith in the powers that be, and they get rebellious. And there was a civil war that happened in Egypt in 2216, I guess it is, 2200, around that time, a great civil war in Egypt. And that began what was called the First Intermediate Period. And so for about 100 years, 150 years, it was chaos. And it wasn't until King Menahotep II came around that he kind of got things together, and he organized people, and okay, and he created another empire. But this empire was wholly different from the empire before. They did not build the big pyramids. And their writing was a little different. Culture was a little different. It was still Egypt. It was still ancient Egypt, but it was definitely a different type of ancient Egypt. Distinctive and removed by 500 years, or at least 400 years, from the empire that existed before that built the pyramids. And he was called, like I said, Mentuhotep II, and that was the beginning of what's called the Middle Kingdom. And the Middle Kingdom survived. Again, it was a dynastic period where you've got fathers and sons and people that are inheriting the throne, being the pharaoh. And that survived from about 2055 BC to around 1795 BC. So again, we're still not up to where Ramses II happened. And so we'll talk about him in another episode later on when I just pretty much focus on just Egypt at that point. But to talk about 2000 BC, basically Egypt is where it was at. Egypt was the most dominant empire during that 1,000-year period between 3000 and 2000 BC. But of course we do have things going on in other parts of the world. So like in the Middle East, which isn't too far away, and eventually they interacted. Of course, everybody knows about Moses, which happened a lot later. But anyway, so you've got in the Middle East, in ancient Samaria, they are fully entering between 3000 and 2000 BC what's called the Bronze Age. And they're making things out of bronze now. They're able to create metal objects and things like that now. And their cuneiform, like I said, that emerged in 3500 BC, but over time, over the next roughly 1,000 years, it became more sophisticated, and they used it for more sophisticated things, until finally, in 2330, you have what's called the Akkadian Empire, which was a great empire at a time when Egypt is sort of falling down at that point. So Egypt, the first really great dominating empire in the world really was Egypt. But then the Middle East, in 2330 BC, you've got Sargon of Akkad. And he basically, was the greatest emperor of the Sumerian Empire, and it was called an empire. And it's the first real empire. And you've got, some cities that are emerging, like Ur and cities like that we mentioned in the episode before. And so, but from around 2300 BC, you've got this empire now, and for about 150 years, you've got this dynasty that he created, Sargon of Akkad, up until around what's called the Ur state. And so then they sort of, his dynasty sort of lost power, and there is a different, so the focus of power shifted to the city of Ur, and it was called the Ur state. And that is in present day Pakistan. It's southeastern Pakistan, but it's in Pakistan. So this is where this was all taking place. But then around 2000 BC, again, major climate change was happening. They had major flooding that was starting to happen, and the Sumerian Empire collapsed around 2000 BC. So all these great empires, the great empire of Egypt that built Saqqara and Giza, the pyramids there, and the Sumerian Empire, and with Sargon of Akkad and the Akkadian dynasty and all that all collapsed around 2000 BC. So, the whole world is kind of having Armageddon around 2000 BC, all related basically to climate change, natural occurring climate change. So in India, so we're moving further east now, you've got what we mentioned this before, the Harappan civilization. And I'm sorry, the Sumerian Empire was not This Harappan civilization is in southeast Pakistan. The Sumerian Empire, I'm sorry, that was in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's called Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. So I was going from Egypt over to Iraq, which is the Mesopotamia, Tigris and Euphrates. Now we're moving east further from that. Now we're in southeast Pakistan, and that's the Harappan civilization. And the Harappan civilization, they did have some writing too that emerged around 2400 BC. They had what's called the Indus script. So they also had some writing too. And so all these people, the Harappans with the Indus script, and of course the cuneiform and the hieratic from hieroglyphics script that were all emerging around the same time. Again, this is around 1200 years before China developed any kind of writing at all, which I know they don't like to admit to, but that's a fact. Now, the Harappan Empire was actually the largest civilization that had ever emerged in the world at that point. And it actually had, in the Indus Valley, it actually had at one point between 2 and 5 million people. It's a lot of people at that time. And they were all living in the same area, living in the Harappan civilization. And I think we talked a lot about the Harappan civilization before. They had very sophisticated cities. And they had, within the cities, they had, you know, sophisticated plumbing and running water. And, you know, they had a lot of, you know, fairly advanced technology that they used in order to have a city, you know, work, you know, with all these people. But ultimately, we talked about what collapsed that empire, like I said when we talked about 3000 BC. But ultimately, it was too many people, and it collapsed the system. And again, they had climate change in around 2000 BC, and between having too many people, putting too much tax on the system that was created, and now you have climate change, that was the beginning of the end of that empire. And so that empire also collapsed. And so the Harappan Empire and the Sumerians and the first great Egyptian empire all collapsed around 2000 or 2100 BC, mainly because of climate change. All right, so then moving over to China. So now we're going further east. Now we're at China. And China actually is far enough away that they were completely isolated from these other empires. So you have some interaction between ancient Egyptians and the Sumerians, and some interaction between the Sumerians and the Harappans. And there's evidence that there was trade taking place between all of those major empires. And even though the three empires were fairly far apart, you know, from basically the area of Giza to the area of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in present-day Iraq, over to southeast Pakistan where the Harappans are, it's fairly long distance in between there, but still close enough that you've got trade. But in between you've got these mountains, you know, the Himalayas, and so you do not have trade much with China at that time. Chinese civilization pretty much evolved totally on its own and at its own pace. And you do have civilization now emerging in China between 3000 and 2000 BC. It's slow to emerge. Mainly they were doing Neolithic farming, and they were actually, you know, they started doing farming in the Middle East in Samaria long ago, and in Turkey. Turkey's where they really found the first farming civilizations from like 10,000 years ago. But China really is the first culture to really develop farming. There was the climate in China was very favorable for farming. And so you have people settling down around the Yellow River and having farms and creating Neolithic farms. And that's how they were living for a while. And that's called the Longshan culture. Again, it's along the Yellow River. And they started making things out of jade even at that time. And so there are jade pieces from like 2500 or 3000 BC. So you can find, so you might find a jade piece. It's like 4,000 years old, and you might say, "Oh, that can't be 4,000 years old." Yeah, it can be. They started making jade a long time ago. But jade pieces that are like 3,000 years old look like this. Can you hold it for 1 second? Stop for 1 second. Okay, so this is a jade piece. It's about 3,000 years old. Actually, it's probably 3,500 years old. And as you can see, it's kind of white. It's not this bright, green anymore. It's kind of white, and so that's what it looks like after a while. Okay, so anyway, and another thing, you have the Shang dynasty then that emerged, and you have a different kind of god that existed at that time, and the god that existed at that time was sort of like a phallic symbol in a way. It's got a big belly, and it's like a cow, but like in a man form. But the huge horns on the cow go up like this, because that's like he's very virile. To have a bull with, actually it's not a cow, it's a bull with big strong horns. That's a very virile bull. It's a very strong bull. So good woman, she's strong like a bull. Okay, like a bull. Okay, but actually the horns come and touch at the top, and that's called the Shang Da, or the Shang God. And I was in Hong Kong inquiring about the Shang Da, and I kept talking to these antique dealers and stuff there, and I was like, okay, so I wanted to verify, because I think I have something that is actually the Shang Da. And I said, okay, so what did Chinese people pray to before they were Buddhist? So before Buddha, what was the religion in China? And they were like, before Buddha? Yeah, before Buddha. Before Buddha? Yeah, what do they pray to before Buddha? Before Buddha? Yeah, before Buddha. So it's like the Chinese just could not wrap their brain around the concept that there was Chinese culture and civilization before Buddha. But actually Buddha is like 500-600 BC, so there was thousands of years of Chinese civilization before Buddha? Yes, before Buddha. And the one god that I've been able to determine is the god that I just described, and that's called the Shang Da. Okay, another thing that they they started to develop textiles at this time, and even though they had papyrus in ancient Egypt, even in like 2500 BC, to write hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics were mostly written on walls and stuff and on tombs, but ultimately they did have papyrus, and that's what they were writing hieratic writing on a papyrus. It didn't hold up very well, and most of it's disintegrated. And the cuneiform was on, the clay, the wet clay, that actually still survives because it turned into a rock, basically. But silk was an actual textile that could be traded, but China didn't actually have trading partners at this time because they were sort of isolated, by the mountains that they couldn't, so they didn't have any contact with these other three civilizations that were starting to emerge. And so, in 2600 BC, they had an emperor called Huangdi, and he created a great dynasty. And so again, that was around the Yellow River area. And then eventually you have the Xia dynasty, which emerged in 2070 BC, and anyway. So that was the first real Chinese dynasty, where we have he's ruling a significant area, and he's like a king, and his descendants, kind of carry the crown after him. And so the very first king at this time of the Xia dynasty, and this is sort of in northern now China. This is sort of north of the Yellow River now, north and kind of west a little bit, like west of Beijing, west even of Xi'an. And so you have Yu the Great. You the great! You the man! No, not you the man. You the great. So why you? You the great. So he was like the first dynastic king that emerged in China, and that was 2070 BC. And the great climate change that happened from Egypt all the way to the Harappan Empire in southeastern Pakistan apparently did not happen in China. So they were good to go. Or they weren't as dramatically affected. And so their dynasty actually started to flourish around 2000 BC. So while these other dynasties were declining, or in a period of decline, even though they came back again, in Egypt especially came back, the other areas just kind of declined. China was doing fine, and China was now just starting to emerge at this time. So that's what you have going on over there. All right, and so that brings us to the other place where there was civilization, because we've talked about these guys. And that's going to be basically South America. Okay, and in South America, and so like I said, so in the Americas and all over the Americas now, you've got people and you've got civilizations. They are becoming agricultural, and they're starting to cultivate animals. What animals that they had, especially like in Peru, they had llamas and things like that. They did not have horses yet. That was much later. But you have, but basically they're still kind of nomadic, and they're sort of still functioning like Neolithic man, and not. They don't have organization. They don't have civilizations. They don't have kings. There may be the head of a clan that might have 100 people, but nothing bigger than that. And that, like I said, that was like 90% of the world. 90% of all people lived in an environment like that. Very few were lucky enough to be a part of a great civilization. And in Egypt, even though lucky meant, hey, you got to work your butt off all day in the scorching heat building a pyramid, that was, you were actually lucky. You actually got some means, you had a home, you had shelter, you had medical help, you had some education that was available. So yeah, I mean, whatever. Luck has many different forms, and it's all a matter of perspective. So in South America, in the area of Peru, in that area, around 2800 BC, you have this civilization called Caral, C-A-R-A-L, that developed in what's called the Supe Valley, S-U-P-E, Supe Valley. And really, it was kind of like a city. And it was the very first urban center in all of the Americas. 2800 BC. That was the first kind of city or urban area, you could call it, in all of the Americas. And so, even though there's civilization that's emerging now in the Americas, as at the same time that you have the Chinese dynasties that are starting at around 2000 BC, and you have even earlier than that, 3000 BC in Egypt and in the Middle East. Even though you've got some civilization and you've got a large urban center in an area of the Supe Valley in Peru, they're kind of behind the times, I guess you could say. So the leaders were the Egyptians, really. They eventually were overcome by the Sumerians later on. And then next after that was China, and then behind that was Peru. And those were all of the major civilizations that were emerging, or that did emerge at that time. And so when you talk about history, it's the only way you can determine history is through archaeological discoveries. And so where there was writing, which is basically in Egypt, and then also in the Middle East, in Samaria, you also have some writing. Those areas are actually, we can actually put together, and also in the Harappan civilization they have Indus script, which is a little bit indescript. You like that? How indescript, there's a little bit indescript. We don't understand it entirely, but you know, there was some type of writing, but they were, like I said, they were behind, a little bit behind. But where there was writing and where it became more sophisticated, like with cuneiform became very sophisticated, it gives us a more definitive description of actually what events happened and what history actually took place. Who were the leaders, who were the kings, who did they conquer, and what were the events that they had to deal with. And so as far as the climate change, I mean, basically that's just something that scientists were able to determine that climate change was happening around that time. Okay, and so basically that kind of covers the whole world in 2000 BC, or at least from 3000 down to 2000 BC. And so now in 2000 BC, we've got an emerging culture in South America and an actual urban center that was that emerged at that time in Peru. So Peru, even though the Incas are later than the Aztecs and the Mayans, the first civilizations actually started in their area of Peru. And then you've got China around the Yellow River now, and the first dynasties of China now are emerging, like Yu the Great, in that area, the first dynasties of China. And you've got already the two areas, so they've got Saqqara and then the three pyramids in Giza. They were already built by 2000 BC and were already marvels. In 2000 BC, those were already 500 years old. And so that was kind of remarkable. And you've got the Samaria, but you've got actually climate change happening, and you've got a collapse of Samaria and the collapse of that empire. And you've also got a collapse of the empire, the first empire in Egypt, and also the Harappan Empire also began to collapse as well, all because of climate change that happened in that area. And so that's the world in 2000 BC. All right, and so that is everything. That includes it. This episode. That concludes this episode, episode 40. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. If you like these episodes, you know, like, share, subscribe, all those good things. And I will see you next time on this channel, Learning with Power with Scott Powers Houston. And you join us next time, and we'll see you then. Take care.